Hello, I'm Sarah Myerscough, and I'd like to welcome you to a small studio in Somerset belonging to Byron and Gomez. I'm here with John Makepeace, and we're going to have a small chat, a little bit about his practice. John was awarded the OBE in 1988. He's a founding member of the Crafts Council. He's also a trustee of the Victoria and Albert Museum. He started Parnham College, which was a very progressive educational establishment for craftsmen, and also Hook Park, which is a huge acreage of woodland just near Parnham actually, which introduced designers to a new form of woodland management. So John, you once said that a significant part of our being needs to be sustained by tangible objects which enrich our sensibilities. That's quite a statement. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about that in relation to these wonderful pieces here, the Embrace collection.
Well, yes, happily. I use the word sensibilities because it has three very significant elements to it. It's physical, material, it's aesthetic, and it's moral. And I think that's what drives those of us who are craftspeople to do what we do. And it's fabulous that one can actually have objects that fulfill our needs, both as makers, because that's what we live for, and for those people who actually use the objects. And I think people actually do get that difference. It's really hard to have objects which are made in great quantities for commercial purposes, where inevitably there are a lot of pressures other than those that drive craftspeople. And it's that which brings these objects to life.
Yes. It's quite hard, isn't it, to see that when you just think of these in terms of furniture, in terms of just a table and a chair, and how could they be so kind of rich in all of that sentiment? It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, that's something you would associate with art, actually, yes. In a way. So it's that lovely argument between design and art.
Yes, I love the sense, of course, that design seems to me to sit at the crossroads between art and science. And there's quite a lot of science in these things, which we develop as craftspeople, but equally we can, through material science, we can do things now that could never have been done before. And that gives us whole new possibilities. Yes. Technology contributes to that. And technology, of course, in the way we're designing, the methods of design have changed how we perceive things. Yes. Because, you know, while we may look at a screen, we're actually able to do things much more three-dimensionally now than the conventions of making things in planar systems. And I don't want to design from a box. I want to get inside the box and use that volume to be able to move freely within that space to achieve something which fulfills our needs as people. And that's, you know, that's nothing to do with manufacturing or speed of ease of production. It's about the object. Yes.
And I mean, the material quality in these pieces, I mean, for me, they seem such gentle works. They're so subtle and simple in form. They're not shouting out in any way. And I think that's got a lot to do with the grain and the way you place the wood and all of that attention to detail, which I don't think is so immediate for a lot of people when they first encounter your work. Could you just tell us a little bit about the process of these pieces? I mean, particularly this piece, which is quite organic in the back.
A chair like this has had so much time and thought put into it over quite a long period. And if one just takes the seat and thinks, well, actually that's some 13 layers of structure alternating, but I wanted the chair to actually just be effectively 5 components. Yes. And, you know, a seat, 3 legs and a back. And that's about as simple as you can go. Yeah. But the seat itself, of course, is layered, and so it has this incredible pattern of the layers crossing one another. So we're getting to see wood in a way that we've never really seen it before. The connections here just wouldn't have been possible. No conventional woodworker would be able to do that with the strength that we have in those junctions. And similarly here, that is something quite new within furniture construction, to be able to have that back straight off a leg here. And it's because of the technology of how we're joining that. The back itself, of course, is so organic because it's a piece of solid bare oak, and its shape is partially determined by the grain of the timber. And so it's really expressing the material from which it came.
Beautiful. And it's really quite figured and marked, the back. I mean, it sort of feels like a painting surface almost. It's got a wonderful texture and real character that you've beautifully highlighted. It's
English oak, and I just love that it's our material, as it were, and it's such a classic British tree. And you think, well, there's oak elsewhere. There is, but there's nothing as exciting as the oak that we have in this country. And in this case, the burr is a phenomenon that really accentuates all its most extraordinary properties.
When you talk about sort of sensibilities in furniture, it's your character as a maker, your own personal character that's actually coming into the piece. And for me, furniture doesn't necessarily have any interest unless it holds the personality of the maker. Do you think that's true, that it actually can reflect?
I suppose as makers, we're prepared to put in whatever time is necessary, and it may or may not be worth it, but actually over time I think you get to a point where more often than not it's more than worth it. It just makes a huge difference to be prepared to, I don't know, it's really love of doing it that makes it possible.
I think these feel quite restrained, these pieces, and I look back at your practice and see how the character of your work has changed from being quite elaborate and quite decorative to actually being, I don't know, a real confidence about it somehow. Do you see that difference in your work and that development?
Yes, I do, and of course one's always looking to produce something that looks and feels simple. Whereas I suppose at one time one puts a lot of time in and wanted to express that time more overtly. I think it was partially a reaction against industrial design, one wanting to differentiate. And now I think one can do it in more subtle ways.
I think also, because I was reading your book over the weekend, and I was really interested to hear about your love of modernist art and abstraction. And I wonder, do you think that freedom in painting has helped you gain a freedom in making?
Well, I love the whole range of the arts. And I mean, my taste is pretty broad. But it does feel as if this is an integral part of it, even though the art world doesn't necessarily recognise furniture as being a part of that.
Well, I do. I think I'm definitely a fan in your fan club. So I'm just going to go back to the questions that I prepared, and I was thinking about the role of craft today, actually. And I mean, for instance, at the turn of the century, we looked at the arts and crafts movement, which was really a reaction against industrialization.
Indeed.
And now I feel that craft really embraces technology, and I think you're a great advocate for that. And I think a lot of the work you've done has been with that in mind. I mean, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes, it's a really interesting one, because I think if William Morris were around today, he would recognise that actually individuality is possible through the new digital age. And it was the kind of pressure to produce volume a mechanised way of producing volume that I think produced such such a reaction as the arts and crafts movement. Whereas now it is possible for people to conceive and make objects that are individual. So one has curiously gone forward and actually picked up a strand that we'd left behind in terms of the expression of the individual in the making.
I mean, you see it as a sort of toolbox. I've often heard you talk about technology as just being yet another tool to facilitate your creativity, really.
Yes. Yes, I mean, clearly digital processes have assisted enormously in terms of the way we conceive objects, how we can then convey that through digital technology, and sometimes those processes can actually be, the processes can be digitized too. We do a little bit of that. None of this is a particularly good example of it, but on occasions we do design actually to exploit that whole process of digital cutting.
I mean, this piece, to all intents and purposes, people would think was just handcrafted.
Right.
But it has, the framework is actually metal.
Well,
in some elements.
Yes, I mentioned the technology that makes this possible. Within this seat, that connection between the leg and the seat is actually 9 steel bolts within an epoxy. And that is giving us a strength that is almost inconceivable in a wooden joint. Where do chairs traditionally fail? At the joints. Yes. Well, now material science says that actually wood isn't terribly good at everything, and that the combinations of material produce an incredibly increased performance.
Yes.
And that's, at the end, somebody wants something that's going to last forever, and that's what I want too.
Yes. I mean, I think these would be heirlooms to people. I mean, I think people should adopt a new way of thinking about why they buy furniture for their homes personally. And you want these to hand down to the next generation, which seems to have been a discarded idea. But I think with your pieces, they very much are that.
It's a really hard one, isn't it? Because when people first buy furniture, of course they're going to buy something they can afford. And probably that furniture doesn't serve them very well, and they then want something better. And one hopes that this is the next step in terms of just have a few things which are utterly beautiful, and that your life, if we want a simpler life, if we want to live more in tune with the environment, then actually fewer and better is the way to go.
So your interest in design and innovation extends to a much wider vision in terms of art education. And you saw that in when you created Parnham College.
Right, yes.
And I mean, that integrated activities of craftsmanship, manufacture, ecology, education, and entrepreneurial skill. So that's quite a lot to get into a sort of curriculum for students. Right. Are you still a believer in that all-rounded vision? And do you think there's potential for that to move forward?
Utterly, but it does seem to me that our education system it has a real difficulty in encouraging the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is somebody who has to have a whole variety of ability, and yet we tend to educate people towards a particular focus, and then they become so specialised in that field that they can only collaborate with other people who do other specialist things. So an organisation becomes made up of everybody who's got their own little territory, but none of them have the entrepreneurial ability to do it all. And so the whole essence of educating people seems to me to be able to give them the freedom to act. And when education is so specialised, it effectively becomes like a training. You can only do this. I want people to be able to do a whole variety of things, and as an entrepreneur, you need to be able to span right from the whole material thing, the concerns of the consumer, the practical skills, the conceptual abilities, and then the dealing with the whole of an enterprise. And those are things which a broad education, I want a Renaissance man rather than a modern man, because the Renaissance man had that kind of confidence to do things, and if he didn't know, he'd find out, but he could embrace it. And that doesn't seem to be the way our education system works. It almost seems to be anti-entrepreneurial.
Yes, I mean, always the sort of, you have the impression of the craftsman sort of whittling in a small studio in the middle of nowhere and totally not, not in contact with industry or, it's sort of a crime almost to be entrepreneurial, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think that Parnham was very good in sort of that new breed of designer, which we see more and more in today's market.
I hope. Yes, I'm not sure our education system is getting better at embracing a broad range of skills. But I had the good fortune to work with the business colleges, with design schools and with craft organisations, but they were so arrogant about each of their different skills. We're this, we're that, we're this. But getting them together is actually what's so thrilling and stimulating. I
think so, because that's when you get that kind of cross-fertilisation between different industries.
Yes.
And I think that's really the essence of creativity. I mean, when I go to art fairs or design fairs or across the world, it's actually very uplifting because it brings together the communities, and there's a lot of people who from lots of different areas, not only in terms of commerce, but also in terms of the fashion industry or the food industry, because we all have a kind of common goal, don't we, in terms of the protecting the environment. And I think it's only through that dialogue that you will move on to the next level of creativity.
Yes, it's a really interesting one as to how does that creativity express itself in products that are mass-made. And one sees signs of it, one reads of it quite a lot in advertising. I hope there will be an aesthetic that comes out of it. And certainly it's something which is, I would hope, integral with objects of this scale, and maybe in that sense craftspeople can give a lead to what one might hope to come out of larger scale manufacturing.
Yes, I hope so. You've commented in the past that you've been particularly attracted to buildings as symbols of different philosophies and attitudes. And I was wondering if this was the inspiration behind Hook Park, which was the incredible project, the 250 acres, I believe, of woodland that you raised funds for in the 1980s.
Yes, I think I respect great architecture as being the equivalent of what we're attempting to do at a smaller scale. And architects, as craftspeople and builders, are building things which they utterly believe in. So they do become symbolic of a set of values, and that set of values is complex. In the case of Hook Park, we were looking for ways to utilise material for which there is no existing precedent within Western society. In other words, we were looking at utilising trees taken out of a woodland in order to release other trees to thrive, because when you start a woodland, there are well over 1,000 trees in an acre. That has to be reduced to something like 100. So 90% of trees come out of a woodland in the early stages. And that wood is generally regarded as rubbish or might go to pulp. What we were doing at Hook is actually utilising those trees being taken out to become structural components. Not sawn timber, but round timber, from 5 centimetres in diameter. that's, as I say, unprecedented. And so nobody understood that material. There were no regulations that permitted its use. And so we were starting with an extraordinarily blank canvas. So thankfully, I had heard Fry Otto speak at the architectural, at the RABA back in 1972, when he had talked about building buildings in Germany using forests that had been damaged in the war and how to utilize some of that material. He converted those what remained of those tree trunks into 2-inch sawn squares and built grid shells covering up to 5 acres in a single span. Well, that blew my mind, of course. And when it came to thinking about a forest and what we might build, it was Fry Otto I needed to speak to. It so happened that his collaborator was Sir Ted Tappold, a British engineer and structural engineer and architect. And I started by talking with him, and then we had both of them on that project. So 2 world minds collaborating on a project which nobody had ever attempted before.
Yeah, that's extraordinary.
Yes. So of course it became symbolic of a whole way of thinking that is sustainable, actually using material which is totally waste to become the main structural material of a whole new campus. I mean, very thrilling.
Yeah, really thrilling. And I remember, looking at the images of the architectural structures was really extraordinary. I just haven't seen anything like it before.
Yes.
And was it a workshop as well?
It was a whole campus, yes. So it was residential, workshops, a library and so on. And of course now the Architectural Association, who run it, is taking that forward in different ways. I'm quite closely involved, and I'm very interested in trying to encourage them to keep hold of that idea of using natural materials, using less energy to achieve results which are true to that material.
And have you seen other projects that have arisen from the work you've done at Hook? I mean, do you think it's caught on, this idea of using woodland in a sustainable way? The
Japanese have taken it on in interesting ways. I haven't seen really anything that quite equates to it. And it was, of course, quite a piece of research to find out what are the properties of timber of that kind. To me, fascinating. The idea of timber in tension is its strongest property, but actually it's the one we use least. Timber in bending, that's how we use timber most, and of course that's what a floor joist is doing. But actually you can then use bending with smaller material to create arches. And timber in compression, which is basically like a chair leg, is a rather good property in the sense that it's quite resistant. We actually use least timber's best property.
Gosh,
timber in tension.
How extraordinary.
But of course it's a design challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And are you working with engineers and biologists, or who do you work with in order to find out a little bit more about the properties of wood?
Oh, well, we did research across Imperial College and Bath University for one stage, and then we involved 5 universities across Europe for the next stage. So it was a big European project.
I was going to mention Fray Otto actually, because I was reading about him as an architect, and quite incredible his range of architecture. And as you said, he worked as a consultant with you. So he believed in a kind of sustainable, holistic framework to design architecture and landscape to support his philosophical values. And I was wondering, do you feel that design and architecture can actually express a moral vision It's a big question.
I think any utterly professional person is somebody of great integrity, and that integrity comes through in their work. It's I think very difficult because construction is so complex. And with Fry, of course, one was working predominantly with one material, and therefore the expression became so much clearer. When you're working with multiple materials, the challenge is greater. So trying to get a moral expression legible within a building is more difficult to achieve and, of course, to perceive.
But you would say, looking back in architectural history, in terms of sort of ecclesiastical architecture particularly, that is rich in moral value, isn't it?
Isn't it extraordinary? Yeah. I mean, I still, every time I see a great cathedral, I think, how on earth did they bring together all of this science and art to produce such extraordinary buildings? Yes. And, you know, if that was their potential, what is ours?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because it's inconceivable. It takes your breath away when you walk into those kind of architectural structures. You can't actually. I suppose it's like walking through a Richard Serra piece of sculpture. It has that kind of monumentality. And yes, do you see that as much nowadays? I mean, we seem to have gone backwards rather than forwards somehow.
Yes, I think it's very difficult in construction to achieve that, and maybe one of the thrills about Hook was one actually was able to do it because one had found a new canvas.
Exactly. Well, I get the sense of that from those sort of organic structures, because I suppose they're so connected to environment and ecology and ecosystems, and it makes you very much aware of the natural world around you. And I suppose that's a sort of new religion for me, is thinking about architectural spaces and design in terms of how they reflect, you know, our current ideologies in terms of ecology and in terms of looking after the world around us.
I have to say, these pieces couldn't have happened if it were not for Hook and the experience of working with scientists on how do you use materials for their best properties. And that's really at the heart of so much of what we do. Those of us work wood, we become very familiar with what it's good at, but actually we're not always so good at knowing what other materials would actually help us to achieve a better result.
But wood is so sustainable because it grows from the energy of the sun. And then, you know, you use such little energy to construct with it. It's so viable, isn't it?
Yes. It is, and yet, you know, here in Britain, we plant trees endlessly, we neglect them endlessly, and what are they going to become at the end of the day? They're going to be fuel, putting that carbon back into the atmosphere. I mean, we should be managing trees. We import 90% of our timber because we neglect our trees. And it seems to me so hideously mad, and yet it has been central to government policy.
Seems a simple thing to rectify, but
One
not
would have thought,
clearly.
Yes, well, certainly in this climate it should be.
Yes, exactly. So you talked earlier a little bit about a new aesthetic, and maybe in contemporary design, collectible design specifically, there is this new aesthetic because people are so focused on the environment and our, you know, sustainability. So do you feel that a new aesthetic in design can be reflective of societal ideas and our concern then for the natural world?
I think it's going to take quite a while for us to actually, certainly for industry, to find a voice that expresses that. And generally industry has traditionally made things look as if they're familiar before it actually finds an expression for something which is really true to that material. You know, so plastics originally sort of made to look like marble or whatever. And the market will move slowly, but I think we have a particular role really as makers to be able to find a way to express an aesthetic of our time that is concerned with, which expresses our concerns. And to me, one of the wonderful things about our landscape is the diversity of our trees. I think what magnificent examples of design. And if we can utilise our indigenous timbers more effectively, then we give more chance for people to plant and grow timber that is going to be useful for subsequent generations. And our forebears did it to some degree. Once government got involved, it looked for quicker crops. But actually, our indigenous timbers are so special that it seems to me we really need to encourage the planting and care of our woodlands in order to give us a sustainable material in the future.
I think it was interesting, you were talking earlier about the Japanese have taken on the model of Hook Park. And it makes sense to me because the Japanese aesthetic is about the imperfect, wabi-sabi, the idea of the organic. And I do see that, and in fact at the gallery we do a lot of work thinking about how to appreciate that beauty in wood particularly, but also in all organic materials and ceramic or glass. And you do see that coming through, that character in design, that sort of organic, a new beauty, if you like.
I would like to be able to say yes. It's not very apparent, but I think it's emerging. Yes. And it's a lot of, we're all seeking, I think we're endlessly seeking the language in which to express those feelings. Yes. Whatever the feelings of our time.
It's quite an emotional response, that sort of new aesthetic. You feel very emotionally attached to material, I think, and that sort of sensory response to design, the tactility, the smell, that's quite interesting how people, I suppose with the pandemic, everybody has been locked up in their interiors and they're starting to think about the relationship to the design pieces around them.
I think those of us who work with material, of course, have a huge benefit. If you're in a drawing office away from the material, then it's just you produce just a commodity. But I think the value of craft is that intensity of being steeped in material and the process, and still being able to have a vision beyond that, which can be a trap, but equally it can be a springboard.
Just to finish our conversation, you once said that if your vision is strong enough, it can become self-fulfilling.
Oh dear.
I thought that was really wonderful and really inspiring. So if you look back over your career, John, do you feel that that's happened?
Yes, it's interesting. I might have said something similar about commitment, because it seems to me that vision and commitment are two sides that make things possible. Vision is interesting in that it actually enables you to share a concept with other people. And so once there's you or a group of people have a vision, then together you're working towards it, and extraordinary things become possible. It's not just that it happens, but of course it infects others, and so it gains energy. And you know about this very well because of the gallery and your team. Yes, exactly. And that shared vision is immensely powerful. But equally, it seems to me commitment is hugely important. And I just love that saying by Goethe, until there is commitment, there is no achievement. And those two things together, and commitment seems to be perhaps more to do with an individual, the vision becomes a group thing, and then it moves on to becoming something that's realised. And yes, I think it has been true that by great good fortune I've met a number of different people in the course of my life, and I can actually blame them in a positive way for what part they've played in changing life for me. And that's sort of a great blessing, really.
That's really beautiful. I think that's absolutely true about community, and I think design is for the greater good when you actually have a group of very committed people around you, and that's certainly true of me as well, as you say.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, John, it's really lovely to talk to you, and thank you so much for taking the time.
No, thank you, Sarah.